So in this clip, we're going to create our first Logic App workflow. I've opened the Logic App Designer. Let's click Add a Trigger to add a trigger. All connectors are being loaded, and as you can see, there is a lot of them. We want the function to be triggered when an image gets added or updated in our blob storage container. Let's search for blob and let's select the Azure Blob Storage Container. That's this one here. The first thing we must do is create a connection. In other words, how are we going to authenticate between our Logic app and our storage account? That's what this connection thing is about. As we know by now, the preferred approach is to use a managed identity for authentication between Azure resources. So that's exactly what we're going to do. I'll give the connection a name, Travel Inspiration Blob Storage Connection, for example. And I'm going to choose Managed Identity as authentication type. Let's click Create New. And we seem to hit an error. The managed identity used with this operation no longer exists, or didn't exist in the first place. And that makes sense because we haven't enabled a managed identity yet for our Logic app. So let's switch to the Identity Blade. I'm going to discard my unsaved edits. And here at the System Assigned Identity tab, I'm going to switch that to On and Save. This will enable a system assigned identity for my Logic app. So we've got that now, but this alone won't be sufficient yet. We must ensure that this managed identity here is allowed to check our blob storage container for new or updated items. So, in other words, at level of our storage account, we must allow this identity access. So, let me navigate to our storage account. And then let's go to the container. It's the destination images container we are looking for. And that has an access control blade on the left here. So let's click that. Here we must now assign a role to our newly created managed identity. So how do you do that? Well, we've got this button here, Add Role Assignment, which is used to grant access to this resource. Let's click that. The first thing we need to do is select the role. The role we want is a storage blob data owner. So let's select that one. Let's click Next. And then I want to select the managed identity that is linked to our Logic app. So let's click Managed Identity here. And let's choose to select the members. And the one I am going to look for is all the system assigned managed identities. And then you should find the one we just created here in the list. So this is the one for our Logic app. Let's click that. It ends up in the selected members part. Let's click Select. And let's click Review and Assign. All right, that should be it. The managed identity of our Logic app is now in the correct role. Let's go back to our Logic app. So let's open it from the list here. And let's go back to the Logic App Designer. We didn't save our changes, so we have to start over. But that's not hard to do. The trigger we are looking for is the blob storage trigger. So we select that one again. Here's our blob storage trigger again. And if I scroll down here, I see that it is connected to the Travel Inspiration Blob Storage Connector. That's the one we were just creating using our managed identity. So far, so good. So let's input the storage account name and the container destination images. And then let's have a look at the rest. We can choose the amount of blobs to return in one go. Let's just leave it at 10. And we can also choose how often to check for items. Every 3 minutes. That sounds okay to me. There's a few other things you can configure here, like potential trigger conditions, a networking retry policy, and so on. But as far as this demo is concerned, we're good with the defaults. If you look at the code view, we can see what code will be generated for this trigger. And that is it. Here's the trigger already. Then let's connect an action to this trigger, sending a mail. So I'm going to push the plus button here and choose to add an action. there's a few different connectors to different mail services. So you've got many integrations to choose from. I happen to have an Office 365 account, so I'm going to use that one's Exchange server to send the mail. So let me select Office 365 Outlook, send an email here. I need to sign in to create a connection to my Office 365 account. I'm going to send the mail to one of my email addresses. And let's add a subject. In a lot of fields, you'll get an option to get the data that was outputted by the previous step. You can get to that via the lightning bolt here. What that data is depends on the previous operation, as you can guess. As the previous operation for us was the trigger, so the blob being added or updated, we get access to some descriptive information. Let's, for example, add the file's name to the subject. Alright, let's add the body as well. Say, this is a test. Next to working with the output of the previous step, you can also apply functions. Those can be applied via the FX icon. There's a lot of functions to choose from here, as you can see, from various string functions over logical functions like if then else or not, to conversion functions like converting from a JSON type to work with, mathematical functions, and so on. Moreover, these can also be applied to the content coming in. So like this, you can build pretty extensive logical behavior. For the demo, I'm going to write out the full metadata from the blob storage trigger. So I do that by trying to make a JSON type of it, which I will then write out. And what I want to make a JSON type of is the body of the trigger in this case. All right. You can, depending on the action, configure other things. For us, this is okay. So there we go. Let's click Save. And the workflow has successfully been saved. When saving, validation of the workflow also happens. So if saving works, validation also checked out. If I click the Code View button on top here, you can see the full code for this logic app. If you wish, you can directly edit the code here. It's not something I personally use a lot, but it is very convenient if you want to store your logic app somewhere in source control to reuse it later on, or even to automatically deploy. Another thing you see on the left here in the menu is the API connections blade. If I refresh this, I see two connections associated with my logic app. Azure Blob makes sense, that's the connection to blob storage, and Office 365, which also makes sense, that's the connection to my Office 365 to be able to send the mail. Anyway, back to the Visual Designer. If we look back at our blob trigger, and we look at how often we're checking for items here, you see we inputted every 3 minutes. Especially in a development environment, it's a good idea to put this on a relatively large value because you don't want to have to pay for that trigger being fired all the time. And you do have to pay for a trigger being fired. So I'm going to put that to, let's say, 10 minutes instead of 3 to avoid having to pay too much. Yet this does pose another problem. Let me save this first. I don't want to wait 10 minutes to test each time I made a change. That is what this run button on top here is for. That will fire the trigger immediately. So to test this, I first need to upload a blob. So the blob trigger is triggered, let's say. And then either I wait maximum 10 minutes, so the trigger is actually checked, or I click run. We still have a request lined up somewhere to modify something in blob storage. In the HTTP file, here we are. I've got this put request to the images endpoint here. That will definitely try and update something in blob storage. So let me change the host address route here to the location of the app service where our endpoint currently lives. All right. And let's send this request. The request was successfully sent. That should mean that something happened to our blob storage container. An image was updated or created. And let's not wait for the trigger to be executed automatically. I'm just gonna press the run button here. And there we go. The trigger was successfully checked. Let's go to the overview. Let's go to the runs history blade now. And let's click one. As you can see here, the trigger was fired and the email was successfully sent. You can look at each of these parts of the run history to get to the details. For example, here I can see the inputs, a get method that checked the trigger. I can see the outputs, including the header and the body. If I look at the email that's being sent, I can see what's inputted, so what's coming into this action, and then also what is outputted to potentially the next part. In this case, a status code 200, this thing checked out. All right, this is a very convenient way to try and see what's going on. It also seems that my Logic app fired twice. That makes sense. If we have a look at the request I sent, I updated 2 images. As a final check, let me have a look at my email inbox. And indeed, here's one of the emails that was automatically sent. A likewise email for the other image was sent to me as well. But it does seem like we made a small mistake. Instead of a function being executed on the body, it seems like I simply wrote out a bit of text to the mail body. Let's fix that. Not just fix this, let's enhance this a bit. So I'm going to say that if the name of the blob, and to get to the name of the blob I must go via the trigger body. The trigger body gives me the full body of the thing that triggered this. And I'm looking for the name field. If that contains Antwerp, I'm going to write out great travel destination. Otherwise, I'll write out okay travel destination. The fact that I happen to live in Antwerp is of course purely coincidental. Let's click add here. This is already looking a bit better. All right, let's save. And I can now do a few things. I can simply send the request again. But what I also can do is go back to my runs history, click one of the previous runs, and click resubmit. This is a very convenient way to test new changes to your Logic app. What will happen if I press resubmit is that the initial trigger will be executed again, but the behavior that happens after that, so the actual logic we designed in the Logic app, will be the one we just created, so the new current version. Let's give that a try. My Logic app was successfully resubmitted. All right. Let's refresh the run history. Here is my new run that apparently seemed to have worked out just fine. Now let me have a look. And if we see, the body that was sent in the mail contains great travel destination. So that is the body that was written out to my email now, thanks to the change in the email body function we made. I can, of course, also validate that by opening my mailbox. And here is that new email with great travel destination in the mail body. So to sum this up, what happened is that I initially sent a request to an endpoint on an Azure App Service, which updated a field in an Azure Blob Storage container, which then eventually triggered a Logic app workflow, which then triggered an action that notified me by email. That's already pretty cool, right? We're going to go beyond this by integrating with an Azure function, but first let's spend a minute or two on testing and debugging Logic apps.